All right, let's do this. Peanut, if you're staying in the room, no talking.
Hey everyone, Michael here. Sasha and I are getting ready to travel to Atlanta to record with some great guests. So Sasha is currently bouncing back and forth between Woodstock and Manhattan just to tie up some loose ends. So she can't be here for this introduction. And this introduction actually has to be super short because Sasha's guest today is John Gossage, and they are going to discuss his long and storied life in photography. So this episode is a bit longer than usual. And this episode might sound a little different from others in that it's less process and practice and more about John's encounters with some historical towering figures such as Lisette Model and Edward Steichen. And John is not shy about describing some negative interactions as well. Of course, Sasha could not have a conversation with John Gossage without asking about the pond, so they have a really wonderful conversation about that legendary work. But before I let you go, PhotoWork is sponsored by Picture House and the Small Darkroom. Picture House has been providing high-end lab, darkroom, and creative retouching services to the fields of art, publishing, fashion, and communication arts worldwide. They are committed to providing excellence in photographic services to professional and amateur photographers alike, and we love them. All right, everyone, thank you for listening, and here is Sasha's conversation with John Gossage.
John Gossage, welcome to the PhotoWork podcast. I have to say, it is truly an honor to have you on. I don't get to say that often without it seeming over the top, but with you, I think I can get away with it.
Hey, wait till you hear what I have to say. It may not be an honor at all. And my end, I want to thank you for inviting me on.
No, it is an honor. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to set you up for too much pressure, but I have a feeling you're going to come through. So, we start every podcast with your background and, where you grew up and all that fun stuff and when you started making pictures. So if you could tell us about that, please.
I'm older now, and I go back a long way in a funny way in that I was born and raised on Staten Island, one of the boroughs of New York, for those who aren't close to it. And I started photographing incredibly young. I had my first professional assignment for the Staten Island Advance, the local newspaper, to shoot sports when I was 14. Yep. So I've been doing this for 63 years. So even more than the age, starting really that young. And also the great benefit for me was being in New York City, because at some point, probably about 14, I realized that the pictures I was seeing that mystified me and compelled me in the photography magazines, which is what I looked at as a kid, to learn what you're doing, that a lot of the photographers were in the same city I was. So I basically, and there was no education, back then, outside of technical stuff, which a neighbor showed me how to, I bought his darkroom equipment, my parents did. And basically I looked, he sort of taught me how to develop film and I got a little manual. But aesthetically, it was like there was sort of two things. It was Lisette Model and Alexei Bradovich. And those were, sort of short courses. And that was the only people that talked about how do you make your photographs get better. So what I did is, as this obnoxious photo child, I went around, for one thing, brought my pictures to the photographers whose names I could look up in the phone book and ask them if I could come by and have them tell me how to get better.
I know that about you, that you did that, and it's really unbelievable. It's so incredible. I like that attitude.
Well, it was all you had. It was, and And also, I mean, the given to the photographers I asked, is that,
they were going to be nice to you.
You don't kick puppies.
Right.
You know what I mean? like here's this child with pictures, like outside. It was only one guy who we will go unnamed, who is probably not even known to most people, who was actually mean to me. But outside of that, everybody else from
you have to have one, photo.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's sort of how all of that started. And one of the givens too that sort of affected things and how I worked. I got thrown out of high school when I was 16. For which nobody even had a name for it back then. I have a degree of a learning disability, a kind of dyslexia, which is based not on reading or anything, but it's based on writing. All I can tell people is that the feeling is like you're a perfectionist with no ability, and you get sort of frozen, and my head would go faster than my hand could write. So basically, whenever I had to write a paper or something for school, I just didn't go.
This is a common theme with artists.
Exactly, and general bad attitude, which sort of goes with basically goes with the territory. And the next year, after I was thrown out, through Magnum, who I was sort of the mascot of, I photographed the same high school for Esquire magazine.
Oh, fantastic.
But it was sort of a very early high-speed move. I won the National Teenage Photography Contest from Camera 35 magazine, and had my first one-man show in New York at this thing, sort of cooperative, called Camera Infinity, if I remember right, when I was 15. Got reviewed in the New York Times. And what I had is a rival, I guess, which was Stephen Shore, Stephen was basically in the same given of everything.
The wonderkind.
Yeah, we hated each other, I think. I think I could say that for Stephen. As kids will do. You're getting stuff that I want, and you over there have got what I want. He got pictures in the Museum of Modern Art. I got a one-person show in New York. We'd glare at each other across the room when we would occasionally meet at openings. Stupid. I mean, we're dear friends now. It's hilarious. And Stephen was thrown out of high school as well, so it was, we were both on the same path. So we had a bit of a role model that what we were doing wasn't totally and absolutely weird.
He was like your doppelganger.
Exactly. Except, like he came from a very different class of people. Like his father was one of the trustees at the Met. And, my parents broke up when I was 10, but my father had business dealings with a gentleman named Gambino. So basically,
well, you were from Staten Island.
I was from Staten Island. What else is there to do?
Right, exactly. That may be an inside New York joke, but anyway.
Exactly. Hey, look it up on the internet.
Yeah.
So basically, I did that, and one of the people who I became friends with, who helped me a lot, particularly with one conversation, was Dan Arbus. And we were both doing the same issue of Esquire. And we wound up at the offices of Esquire, at the same time by happenstance. And I'd met her through Bruce Davidson before, so we sort of knew slightly who each other were. But she took me aside. I think we had coffee afterwards, after whatever we had to do at the offices. And she gave me some really good advice, which related to what her life. She said, John, I really like your work, very kind and everything. And she said, but one of the things that I regret the most, which she regretted the most, was basically that she had made pictures that other people wanted her to make as opposed to her own early on. That she didn't really, totally listen to her own voice until a bit later in life. And she said, you're too young to have these guys, these Esquire guys and everything, telling you what to do. It's going to ruin you. And it was a voice, basically something said, literally, that it's sort of been rumbling around in my head that I was this kid, so I was an outsider to everything. Everything felt weird. But it was like it didn't feel like right somehow. But there was no art scene. I mean, one of the things, there was nothing going on that had any other possibility. People made their commercial work, and what they would say is, I also have some personal work.
Right.
But that didn't mean there was any venue. The venue, and the joke was, you took your pictures up to Edward Steichen at MoMA. If he liked your work, he would buy one for $35, ask you to donate 3 others, and basically you needed to live on the $35 for the rest of your life.
Right.
That was it. That was the end of the story. And by happenstance, and this is too complex to go on, but basically I discovered through a friend and a story in the New York Times, a friend who had gone to Black Mountain College. And we were sitting drinking wine in his place one night, and he just said, John, he was a very literate man. And he owned a bookstore in Greenwich Village. And he just said, John, you're illiterate. I mean, you basically have almost never read anything. And I get it, but, and I get it why you're not adapted to school, but Black Mountain would have been perfect for you, which dissolved long before, And there was a story in the back of the front section of the New York Times on a school in Washington, D.C. that was a Ford Foundation project to develop alternative education called Walden School. And Nick basically made me, forced me, and mostly wrote it himself, a letter to Walden School. We somehow figured out an address. I don't know how we did that. I can't remember. That this sounded perfect for me. And a man named Alex Rode started this, brilliant man. And there was no real alternate education for kids, high school kids, basically, that didn't fit anywhere. And he was trying to develop that. He wrote back and said, obviously, it was a very nice letter because Nick had written most of it, and he was a brilliant writer. So it was like I'd impressed him with something I really couldn't do. But he came to New York, and he said, I'm coming to New York. I'd like to meet you. So basically, I met him, and my only calling card was my photograph, so a little 8x10 box of photographs. And he looked through 5 or 6 of them and said, these are the best pictures I've seen since Robert Frank's Americans.
Wow.
One, civilians didn't know Robert Frank's Americans,
right.
So that impressed the hell out of me. And then, that, and he said, you're in the school. And being a New York boy, that immediately made me think, this is a scam. Like I'm being hustled somehow or other. But he said, come down to Washington. You can't come in this semester. You come in next semester. And, you sit in, see if you like it and everything. And I came down to Washington. And to my great absolute shock, because all of my friends were adults at that point in time. My girlfriend was 10 years older than I was. And basically, there was this room, and the school was 5 teachers and 15 students, too.
Amazing,
by the way,
yeah.
Because it was really a research project to try to find a system that could be replicated elsewhere as well. And to my great shock, there were 15 kids just like me. And it was like, it took me quite a while to get over the fact that I wasn't, I wasn't that unique.
Right,
thank you.
right. I understand.
And that moved me down to Washington. It wound up being a lot easier to live here than it was in New York. I moved out of home when I was 16 or 17. So I moved to Washington, and I got incredibly lazy because I've stayed here all these years. Obviously, as a photographer, I travel a lot. So, I see a lot of other things. But I still live relatively close to the original apartment, or the second apartment I had in Washington here, within 7 or 8 blocks of it. And it's just worked.
And what other schooling did you have after that, in the arts?
None. One of the things that went on is that there were feeder schools that wanted Walden graduates. I was solicited by Harvard and Princeton. And basically, I was of two minds. Harvard was the place that was most interesting because their given was that if I could make it through the first year, I could take photography. I didn't need it. They don't really. Back then, they didn't have much of a program, but Ricky Leacock at MIT had an adjacent program that was connected in filmmaking. And I thought, well, that's the next thing I should know about. But with Walden, they had adapted to my writing difficulties and everything. I kept thinking, I've finally gotten this under control and don't feel like I'm an utter idiot. Even with all the stuff at Harvard, if I go back there, it's going to be the same problem all over again. And I put it off for a year, and then the next year, I just told them I wasn't going to go. Yeah, and so basically that's where my education ended with Walden. And there was nothing to learn, particularly, after coming out of New York, like at 16 and 17, I was hanging around with Sol LeWitt and, Eva Hesse and Carl Andre and Hollis Frampton and such. Like basically the art scene in Washington seemed pathetic to me.
So how do you, it seems like The Pond, which is, of course, the body of work you're most well known for, and which is, really, it's, not hyperbole to say it's an iconic body of work, photo book. When did that happen? Like, so you're in DC, you've gone to this wonderful school. How much later do you do The Pond?
In between what I've described to you, I met a curator here, Walter Hopps, who is a brilliant curator who'd left the Pasadena Museum of Art and come to the Institute for Policy Studies, a left-wing think tank that a man named Phil Stern had started in Washington. Walter, if people that don't know him, he basically, when he was 28 years old, he did the first Marcel Duchamp retrospective at Pasadena. He was an utterly brilliant man. And again, the story that's too long and tedious to tell. He wound up seeing some of my pictures and putting it in a show, so the summer group show. He had become director of the Washington Gallery of Modern Art, another thing that Mr. Stern had started, and his wife Lenny. Through a friend, given my friend some pictures to show to Walter, and Walter invited me to come by the gallery, and I came in the door, and my pictures were the first photographs in this group show, and no one had told me we were going to put it up. And Walter and I became close friends for the next 10 or so years. He said, look, one of the things that I think is really important is all of artistic practice in America should not be focused on New York. If it's at all possible, if I make it possible for you to stay in Washington economically, will you not move back to New York? And I said yes, because what he did, he, through his contacts and everything, I bought a 4x5 speed graphic and learned how to photograph 4x5 transparencies of artwork. Very non-vision oriented work, very technically oriented. Oh, right. One thing I should draw back to coming down to Walden and after Arbus talking to me too, is that at that point I decided when I came to Walden, I was not going to photograph anything that was outside of my actual life. Basically, that was sort of the message that I had in my head, and that Arbus had reiterated, that I was basically going to make quote unquote personal work and nothing else.
Yeah, that's a big decision, a big parameter, which is important. Parameters are so important, and that's why I'm using that word and underlining this. I think that's incredibly, that's like one of those things that I don't know if you realized at the moment or it's sort of in retrospect, but it's like, wow, career defining, right? Or the word career is clumsy, but your artistic practice defining.
It was survival. It was like, I need what photographs actually do. One of the things they do is they give you a vision of at least your subjective sense of what's really true in a scene you're seeing in front of you. And I needed that reinforcement of this alternative life. This kid that didn't really fit anywhere comfortably needed to keep reinforcing that. That's why, photography saved my life. It was that simple. It wasn't a choice to go to school. It wasn't a practical thing. It was like, especially where I come from, you couldn't quite believe what anybody told you. But if I saw it and I had a picture of it, it actually was real. It was like reinforcing a reality that was my reality rather than what I was raised in. On Staten Island, I never felt that I even slightly fit in anywhere. And when you're this adrift child, failing all your courses except mathematics. By the way, I can do mathematics in my sleep. So basically, I would get 100% on advanced mathematics and high school mathematics. So I was this weird child that the public school system had no idea what to do with. So
I can relate, by the way.
Oh, good. All right. Hey, another weird child. Hey, here we go. But, so I stayed in Washington. And through the Washington Gallery of Modern Art, this was actually a semi-funny story in my lack of understanding of how the art world might work, is that they had a workshop for artists. They had bought a row house building. They had 3 photographers, Joe Cameron and Mark Power, Washington photographers, and they invited me to be part of the workshop, which was a dark room I could use and everything. It was sort of a technical place and sort of a meeting place. And we had the sculptor who's died since, Ann Truitt, was there. So, and what arrived in the mail was this check for a couple $1,000. And I looked at it, and it was like from the Washington Gallery. And I brought it back to return it because there had been a mistake. And Walter had to explain to me what a grant was, which seemed like a real scam to me. Like, hey, I got money for not doing anything. Hey, I like this.
There's that suspicious nature again.
How often do I get these checks? Like, is this weekly or monthly or, But it really was unknown to me. I thought, they're going to want the money back, so I better bring it back now. And as this happened, the scene evolved, around me. All of a sudden, there was Whitkin Gallery in New York, and there was some sense that actually photography could be shown in art galleries and appreciated. And I wound up with first a gallery, which you probably have not heard, Washington Gallery, Jefferson Place Gallery, which had been the gallery of like Kenneth Noland and the Washington Color School people and everything. A woman named Nesta Dorrance, and she showed my work. And then the gallery sort of was ending when just by age and economics, and I wound up being represented by Harry Lunn, who Lunn Gallery. And Harry really invented the business aspect of fine art photography.
Yeah, very, very important figure in our world.
Exactly. Sort of complex man, let's put it that way kindly. But at the same time, he knew how to run a network. Since he was ex-CIA. And just when I was thinking, all right, now's the time, I have to move back to New York. I have to get a gallery in New York. This is the moment. This is what graduate photography students want to kill me for. In 1 week, I got 2 letters. And Harry Lunn coming to me and saying, this relatively new gallery, Light Gallery, would like to represent you. And the 2 letters, one were Ileana Sonnabend and Leo Castelli, all inviting me to come up and that they were interested in possibly showing my work. And it was like, oh, I don't have to move to New York now. That's done. And I wound up being with Leo Castelli for just about 15 years, I think.
Wow, it's amazing. Yeah.
And miscellaneous terrifying experiences, like my first show at Castelli at 77th Street was with Jasper Johns. I mean, like this is...
Oh, that's incredible. Yeah.
And Jasper was very kind and nice and everything. And obviously all of his paintings had sold for whatever, at that point, considered astronomical, but considered starter art prices now. And everybody came, too. Yeah, everybody, like every art, he hadn't done a show in like 7 years. The whole art world came to my opening. I mean,
Right. I'm sure that was terrifying.
Woody Allen and Diane Keaton bought picture. It was like, all right, I can live with this. I like this. But I was terrified.
And what work was that Castelli was showing?
It was sort of, let's put it this way. Looking back, as you do, I wish I had the sense that I have now back then. It seemed to be a scattered of just pictures. They had no real 35 millimeter. Actually, what had happened is that, let's back up a little. One of the things that happened is that Walter Hopps and his deputy in Washington was a man named Hal Glicksman, set up a blind date, if you will. He said to me, because I was going to go to the West Coast, I'd gotten a small grant from National Endowment from the Arts, a project grant, that to travel, to do the Robert Frank thing. I'm going to travel across the country and take pictures, blah, blah, blah. But if I was going to the West Coast, there was only one photographer I had to meet. That was Louis Baltz. And they told Louis the same thing if he came to the East. So basically we were set, and I wound up out in Pasadena, actually, staying at Walter's house, sharing it with Bruce Nauman. And basically, they were right. I mean, Louis and I became best of friends, until his death, relatively recently. And we really, hopefully from my end, I did a little bit, but I certainly can say that Louis really helped me think and educated me about thinking about pictures in a way that I hadn't before, but seemed natural once we started sort of talking and dealing with it. So there was a show at Baltimore Museum called 14 American Photographers. And it started out as being a São Paulo Biennale representation of America. And it was to Walker Evans and the people that sort of come out of that aesthetic. And it sort of somehow it got, a man named Renata Danese, the director of the museum, was the curator of it. And I'd been asked to be in it, and Lewis and Eggleston and Bob Adams and, the crew,
Yep.
But the crew that nobody knew really existed very much. And somehow the Biennale thing fell apart, logistically or whatever. And it wound up being a show that traveled around America. And Louis, who was, I believe, the first photographer shown at Castelli, was already there, and he brought the catalog to Leo and basically said, these are the folks.
Right.
Like this is the living photographers, and Friedlander and Winogrand. And Leo sort of used it as a wish list. He picked the stuff that made some degree of sense to him and everything, and asked us to come. So basically, that introduction came via Louis, but through Castelli.
Right.
So that's how that happened in any case.
It's interesting because you and Louis, in some ways you're observing the world in a similar way, not the big grand scenes or big grand moments, but your aesthetic is so different. You're very yin and yang. And so that must have been a really beautiful relationship.
I mean, there's no reason to hang around people that reinforce your own tics, if you will, stylistic tics and everything. It was the kind of intensity that we both tried to put and rigor into what we were doing. And Louis had things that I didn't have, and hopefully I had things that he didn't have that helped us both. Still to this day, I do believe Louis is the smartest person I've met in this medium. So it was very invigorating. We had great times in different places around the world.
So let's get into some specifics.
All right.
Tell me about the genesis for the idea for the pond. Do you remember the moment when you had the idea for the project? How did that come about?
Well, one of the things, it's actually technically my second book, only in that one of the things, I remember Leo Costelli looking at me very sadly, and he said, "John, why is photography so inexpensive?" I mean, obviously, he was shocked that you could, I forget what we were charging, like $250 a piece was like lunch money for what Leo was doing, obviously.
Right. Yeah.
So they were trying to develop, we were, by the way, in
a market,
in graphics. As Leo's gallery worked, anything that was a multiple, so the collectors understood that there was more than one of these, was sold under graphics that his wife, Tawny Costelli, sort of handled day to day and everything. So under that, which is like Jasper Johns lithographs and all of the stuff that you would expect. So they were trying to figure out how to market it. So they proposed, was there some kind of edition I could bring out? So I did a book called Gardens, which is this, original prints. I decided let's kind of start where photography starts, which is the 19th century albums. Original prints mounted on board. It's like Walter Hopps did a curated text of every interesting reference to the idea of gardens, starting with Pliny the Elder and ending with The Year I'm Born with Ezra Pound. It's all letterpressed. It's a 2 Moroccan goat hide binding by the master binder, Don Etherington at the Library of Congress, edition of 25. So basically, we made something that there was absolutely no market for.
Right.
But, like MoMA got one. I mean, it was all institutions. The V&A, Bibliothèque Nationale, National Gallery of Australia has one for some reason. So I think we sold out of the edition of 25, we sold about 5 or 6. And we didn't bind them all. The binding was incredibly expensive. So basically we bound 10 copies or whatever out of it, and then kept everything else. After those sold, we would bind the next ones, and it never sold. But the last 2 copies that I have that are bound and everything, I sold one of them at Perry Photo a few years for $85,000. So,
nice.
It was sort of
it's a long game.
Yeah, exactly. Somebody finally got it. What is it? 30 years later, I got it.
It is, though. It really is a long game.
So, all right. So, but back to the pond. The book thing, Lewis had the book first. He had New Industrial Parks. And we talked a lot about that. And, what his thinking was in it, what he wanted to have happen with it. And pretty much that book, great book and everything, but he pretty much gave away at least half of them. I mean, everywhere he would go or with a collector and everything, he wound up giving, it was like a calling card.
Right.
It was like hardly any I think Light Impressions distributed it. Mm-hmm. But one of the things about books, especially like when I'm 14 and with Lisette and everything, one of the great gifts that I got, and I knew all these photographers and everything, I would ask them what books I should get. I'm trying to learn. And Lisette, actually, what I asked, a very 14-year-old question to Lisette. Ms. Model, and, semi-terrified of her, basically, who is the greatest photographer who ever lived? I wanted to get to the heart of it. And she said, darling, which she always called people. And basically, I was also Lisette's friend till literally had dinner with her a week before she died. She's a wonderful, wonderful, brilliant person. But she said, darling, you really shouldn't think like that. Arts aren't competitive in that way. And then she looked at me, and she was my ultimate teacher. She knew exactly how to cut to the heart. But there is someone. His name is Eugene Auger. And then she knew how to get me. But darling, you wouldn't understand him. So of course, that immediately sent me. There was the only Auger book that existed was published in about 1929. It's the original thing that Bernice Abbott put together. And the American publisher was a great art bookstore on Lexington Avenue called Y. And of course, it had sold so well that when in the 60s I'm going there, they still can find me a new copy in the basement for $10. And of course, Lisette's right. Little brown pictures of Paris mean nothing to a kid trying to learn how to street shoot on the streets of New York. But Bruce Davidson recommended The Americans by Robert Frank, which made a lot more sense to me. It looked like the world I was in. And somebody else recommended American Photographs by Walker Evans. So those are my first three photo books, which is sort of a good place to start.
Yep.
When I could, I didn't have that much money, I would pick up books and everything. That was my access in more than shows. I mean, there weren't that many shows. I mean, in New York.
Well, that's the way it is today. I mean, even if there are a lot of shows in New York, and they're not, by the way, photography, is still, I mean, it's had some moments of more glory, so to speak. But for the most part, there's not been a huge change in the way the world understands, fine art photography. But there certainly are not shows on a regular basis all around the world or all around, say, the United States. And so it's books. That's how people learn. So I don't think anything's changed in that regard.
So basically, I thought, look, what I need to do is do something like New Industrial Party, like basically have a book that actually people can get. And, and in America particularly, and I saw Lewis's difficulty in getting his book out and everything. So there, I made a choice of the many publishers that were open to an American photographer. It was either Aperture, or Aperture. So.
And thank God for them, boy. I mean, grateful.
So I started thinking about what I wanted to do, like what's possible. First book is a real set of decision. It sort of plants the stake, if you will, in the ground. Actually, something I've done just recently, pandemic and, like too much time at home routine. I put together actually the book, which is called Ornamentals now, of the work that I was going to do as the first book that I sort of took a left turn from to do the pond. I sort of started doing one set of things, and I don't remember how this thought came into my head. One of the things you do especially back then, you look at how photographs relate to each other and how a context is set. And a lot of the sort of connecting parts of connecting one photograph to another, which is a very unnatural thing, by the way, was sort of the Life magazine photojournalist thing. It's almost a cartoon strip kind of sequencing. The country doctor gets up in the morning, has his coffee, walks down the road. It was very, very simplistic. I mean, literally like cartoon panels. And that seemed very uninteresting. But the fact that there was this potential for narrative consistently kept coming back to me. And then the idea is, well, one of the things that I don't think has ever been done is narrative landscape. Let's think about that. And the idea of something very, very simple, that you take a step off of the pavement into this middle land, not in no way bucolic kind of mid-range nature. And then you walk through it and you wind up getting back home. Let's just make a very, very simple story, but elaborate on it in complex ways. That seemed a cohesive idea. I didn't know if I could do it. I didn't know if I did it, if it would be of any interest, but I would try to do that. And I think the shooting took about 2.5 years or so to get, something that was satisfying. And then I had something, in mind. And there is a woman at Aperture, Carol Kazmarek, who was wonderful, wonderful person. She was the one that you went to if you had something interesting, and she would figure out a way to getting around Michael Hoffman.
Right. He was the head of Aperture at the time. Yeah.
And Michael was sort of using Aperture for the care and feeding of Michael Hoffman. So, and, all he wanted to do was Paul Strand books. So, and Minor White books. So. And actually, the deluxe edition of the Pond, of the recent reprint of it, comes with a print, and it comes with a copy of the letter of Aperture rejecting the Pond, which you took a bit to get Leslie to put in. But I said, but hey, Leslie, you did it.
Leslie's a close friend of mine, so I'm hearing her voice in my head. Let me just go back a second, because you said, Michael Hoffman wasn't interested and he was, preoccupied with Paul Strand was not obviously, but Paul Strand is a big part of Aperture, and I think they have the archive, I think, and it's actually the second photo book I ever got was Aperture's Paul Strand book after Aperture's Dorothy Lang book. So do you think that there were people, and Michael may be one of them, I don't know, but who didn't understand the language, the visual language that you were using? Because at that point, there weren't a ton of photographers using the language that you used, the visual language that you used in the Pond. Some people at Aperture got it, but do you think there was just simply a disconnect or that they were worried that the general public wouldn't understand this language?
Oh, it didn't sell at all. I mean, one thing that got Aperture all excited is the Pond got reviewed in People magazine. Believe it or not.
Oh, God, that's
and
bizarre.
I looked at it and said, there's no cross-reference between the audience for People magazine and anyone who would buy this book,
Right, yeah, that is odd.
So, like I did a book signing at ICP. They set up for me, and one person came. I mean, basically, you couldn't give them away. I mean, Michael's whole thing was less aesthetic and more had to do with money, which being the head of Aperture, to keep it going and everything, that's not totally unreasonable. He basically wanted to take no risks. And, the fact that Aperture, as a nonprofit publisher, which was almost unheard of except for university presses and everything, I think they were challenged and audited like 5 or 6 times and everything because it was so unprecedented. And Michael kept that going, to his credit. But at the same time, I don't think he had an aesthetic agenda at all. And basically, it allowed me to totally design with a friend in Berlin, Gabriele Gertz, who's now become sort of a major designer in Amsterdam and head of graphic design in Kassel, Germany, and everything. She and I designed the book together. And I mean, my thing of making everything personal and everything, I wasn't going to let anybody else, get involved with the aesthetics of what I was doing.
You're a prolific, you put out a tremendous amount of books. I mean, is this...
In no relation to demand, by the way.
But is this the point at which are you just loving this process and thinking, I'm going to dedicate myself to making photo books, which you've done? I mean, are you sort of getting, because obviously you have to love something, right? I mean, if you're going to put out as many books as you've done, I would assume you love the process.
Somewhat. It always seems like it'll be more fun until I get involved in it. I mean, the technical stuff and everything is obviously, like doing stuff that I've done, in the last few years with Steidl. It makes it much easier because basically, I mean, Gerhard is utterly unique in that he is both the publisher and the printer. So everything's, and also, to put it mildly, Gerhard's fairly good at the printing stuff.
Yeah, he is.
And now I've digressed enough. What were you asking? That I liked it. All right. Yeah. Well, one of the things I really did not like or find intellectually interesting, the aesthetic of the medium of art photography, in the 80s, 70s and 80s. It was this sort of Museum of Modern Art masterpiece, single image. I mean, in truth, having been raised sort of in the contemporary art world, in New York, I found like the dialogue about the medium fairly dumb. The only voice that seemed to have any gravity to it, and even with his very, very limited sense of what he wanted, was John Sarkowski. Mm-hmm. Basically, nobody else had an interesting take on what... I mean, how can you take a medium seriously that reveres Yosef Karsh and Ansel Adams? I mean, come on. I mean, it's crap. Ansel always just wanted to be Edward Weston, and Karsh is just a very glossy studio photographer. And that sort of discouraged me. But with books, not only do you put the pictures together and have them amplify each other so that they, if it's done correctly, they get a greater strength than the floating individually on their own. You get to set the context with each book of what's being asked of the viewer. This is what we're doing.
You just said, even with his limited sense of what he liked, talking about John Sarkowski, who was the head of photography at MoMA for many, many years and considered sort of a giant and hugely influential. Tell me what you meant by even with his limited sense of...
Well, John hated modern art. Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember going up to see him for something, and there was a Bernard and Hillebesher show of Pennsylvania coal tipples. So I looked at the show, and I thought it was wonderful and everything. When I came up to see John, it's just John, a wonderful show and everything. And he had his pipe, which he sort of chomped down and he said, "It's the sculpture department." It's like he didn't approve of this.
That's not that outside, though. That work is not really that outside of what John liked, though, right? I mean, because...
But it was enough outside that it really annoyed him that it existed in the museum and it was photographs. And obviously, he'd probably heard from other people how wonderful, quote, his show was. And it was a show that he had, deferred doing.
Is there other work that you would have liked to have seen John champion more?
Well, let's put it this way. He didn't particularly champion Louis Baltz's work. Mm-hmm. Louis he brought up, I think it was initially the tract home portfolio. It may have been in industrial parts. I don't remember anymore. So John had picked out certain pictures that he wanted for MoMA for that, and Louis had to inform him that either he had to take all of them because it was a context. Mm-hmm. That he was interested. Mm-hmm. He was interested in the issues more than the individual objects. Mm-hmm. And it was really a battle. I mean, eventually they took it, but John gave them all back to him. I mean, and as far as I know, during John's tenure, I don't think he ever showed Louis's work. Mm-hmm. John had certain things. I mean, obviously he has some great achievements. And speaking about his thoughtfulness about a kind of photography. He'd done a history of photography show, and again, I was there for some reason. And he asked me how much I liked it. And I said, I liked the 19th century part of it better. Mm-hmm. And he said, yeah, I like the 19th century better as well. It was like, that's the aesthetic that he most felt comfortable in. I mean, and also like the great work he did with Auger and, literally probably discovering in the major field, Dion Arbus, and Bill Eggleston and, like all this stuff. He deserves an immense amount of credit, but he also missed a lot. Mm-hmm. Let's put it this way. Can you ever picture John Sarkowski warming up to Jeff Wall?
No,
it ain't gonna happen.
But I haven't warmed up to Jeff Wall, but I have a lot of respect for him. And there's a lot of artists who don't, whose work doesn't really move me personally, but that I really respect. But I do think it's tricky because as a curator, you do your best work, whatever you're doing, if you really feel passion towards it. If it really moves you, if you really get it. I mean, I've had this too. It's very difficult to do your best work curating whether it's a show or a book or whatever, if you don't have a real feel for something. And
exactly. No, I mean,
I'm not defending John, by the way. This is just fascinating to me. And as someone who doesn't really feel Jeff's work, but does have great respect for it, which is how I feel about a lot of artists, right? I really respect, but I don't necessarily feel it in my bones.
And in my sense, it's not John's fault. It's the field's fault that basically it did not engender another player with a different take of equal degree of seriousness and intelligence. Mm-hmm. There was nobody else out there. Right. Everything else was sort of feely, touchy nonsense.
I have questions for you, but is there any... I don't want you to get off and feel like we didn't talk about the Berlin work or...
Well, let me do a quick thing on the Berlin book, the Berlin in the Time of the Wall. One of the things I'm very interested in, I have a decent library. And one of the interesting things was that Iko Hosoi, I have a lot of Japan books, did Ordeal of Roses, an original edition. One of the interesting things that he did that I don't think many people are aware of, he had 4 different designers design different books around that particular body of work. And one of the things that I know Gerhard Steidl always wanted to do, he literally got involved with me after seeing a PDF of the Berlin book, but the Berlin book was already in production, so he never got to do it. I'm going to suggest to him, which he may or may not do. They're probably the greatest book designer alive at the moment is a woman in the Netherlands, Irma Boom. And to basically give her that book and say, do whatever you want that isn't this, and do another edition with, since it's been out of print for a while, it costs hundreds of dollars. To do that and to see what looks like and give her absolutely carte blanche. Whatever she does, I want to do.
Well, it's interesting because I was going to ask you how fixed books are. So, could you sit down today and re-edit some of your iconic books? How much do you know to be really true in the sequencing and in the selection?
One of the things that happens, I think it happens to everybody, but nobody speaks about it. You wind up having 1 or 2 pictures in the best edit annoy you and wish you'd taken them out.
Right, of course.
I always have that, like, God, you just should have taken that out, like more than putting anything. I mean, the books become, for me at least, kind of solid events that I have no particular inclination to change at all once they're done. Outside of this experiment with Berlin, I have no inclination to do that. Anything I've done, for good or ill.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think it's good to be settled and not be tormented by... I heard you did this little film for Steidl, I think was a promotion for the trilogy of books, The Nicknames of Citizens, Jack Wilson's Waltz, and Should Nature Change. And at the end of this little promo thing, you just said something I love, but I want to ask you about it. You said if you were talking to students now, what you'd say is, I have no idea what I'm doing anymore, and I'm totally sure of it, and that's how it works.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, explain that. I love it, I think, but explain it.
Well, one thing I want to correct, too. It's actually not a trilogy. There are 3 more books in the series. There's 6. Everything got derailed by the pandemic. And
yeah, I was wondering about that because I saw, you can see on the Steidl website that there's more coming. And right. Okay. Yeah. Yep. I know it's going to be in a clamshell, or not a clamshell, but I know it's going to be in some like beautiful box at some point. Like
what I asked Gerhard keeps saying, "Do you want a slipcase and everything?" And
the answer,
no.
Oh yes, John.
No, I want people to feel totally free to buy just one.
Well, you can do both. Look, put me on with Gerhard. We'll work this out. There should be both options.
I mean, Gerhard says we are going to do this and looks at me with that Gerhard look. We will do it, but he knows
you must
what
have
I
the
want
Henry Wessel slipcase collection. It's so fantastic. It's
Yeah, but they weigh too much. I mean,
yes,
I've got
but
all
you
those
can
Eggleston
kill an
things. They
intruder
weigh
with
a
it.
ton.
It doubles as a weapon, or you can, a door stop or something. I don't know.
It's good to flatten prints. I know.
Everything in this day and age should have multiple uses. So I think
Exactly. So back to the comment.
So I'm going to say it again. I have no idea what I'm doing anymore, and I'm totally sure of it, and that's how it works.
When I did a project, I finally hit a certain point. I've been photographing a long time. I did a project in Venice and actually in Marghera across the lagoon for a book called The Romance Industry. And at that point, something happened. It was like they were choosing some of the sites I would photograph and everything, but I knew exactly instinctually what needed to be done. Literally, I could see it finished before I was a quarter of the way into it. And it was like, oh, that's an interesting gift. And it worked out. I mean, basically, I knew exactly what I needed to have and how many days I needed to do it in. And then from then on, I just wander around and things seem to present themselves to me outside of my control. I mean, this sounds sort of, feely touchy, kind of mysticism.
Sounds like you just have a strong foundation.
It's gotten into my blood enough that I don't need to think about it anymore. And when I get the work back, it always looks like they're pictures that are better than I know how to make.
Yeah.
So why would I screw with that?
Yeah.
I mean, like, hey, I'll take the gift. Thank you. Thank you very much. I guess you put, enough dues in, 30 years of dues in or whatever, and you get a gift back. You get a free gift.
Well, that connects with...
Well, every 30 years, you get a free gift.
That connects with some of the books. You shot some art students in Minnesota. You said that you just shot on autopilot, and when you saw the contact sheets, you were stunned by them, and you thought, take a hint, John, you should do more of this like they knew more than you did. The pictures knew more than you did. And that's what you're saying, I think. Yeah.
Exactly. That's the reason I started making pictures. The pictures knew more than I did. I mean, understand, I come from a different generation where there was no commercial potential, there was no career, there was no school, there was no need to verbally defend or support what you did. Why would you do it if it didn't offer you something that you couldn't get anywhere else? Let's put it this way. I make objects of fascination. The fascination is mine, as well as hopefully the viewer. I've had a whole life. I've never had a job. I've done exactly what I wanted to do. I'm not the richest person, but I'm not the poorest person on earth. And I won the bet.
Well, John, thank you so much for spending time with me today and getting into it all. It's been really fun talking to you.
And thank you for not asking the obvious question of what is the meaning of life, which I was terrified you were going to ask at 10 o'clock in the morning.
I like my guests. I would never do that. All right, John, thanks again, and be well. Take care.
Thank you. All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
PhotoWork with Sasha Wolf is a production of the PhotoWork Foundation. Executive producer is Sasha Wolf, and the associate producer is Taylor Selsback. The show is also produced and edited by me, Michael Chovin-Dalton of Real Photo Show. Music is by J. Walter Hawks. If you like the show and wish to find out more about the Foundation, please visit photowork.foundation and be sure to subscribe and review with all the stars on your listening platform.